My name is Jason, and I have worked for the past few years in conservation in Pennsylvania. I live in York County, which is where I grew up. So Chesapeake Bay watershed, southern Pennsylvania. And I worked in that space for a few years in a few different roles, watershed forestry, urban forestry. And it's a space that I've grown to love. I grew up hiking out in nature, all that kinds of stuff. And for me, it felt like the thing that I was called to do professionally. Um, I've taken a bit of a step back from that recently, and I'm working more in an international wildlife conservation space, which is also really exciting. And I've actually personally been feeling a bit of a disconnect to local conservation recently. So that's why I was really glad to be invited into this space. So thanks again for that. Um, with that, I guess I'm gonna jump into my talk here. So I just gave it a quick title of Trees, Reforestation, and Penn's Woods. Um, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about trees, how to plant them, and why we plant them. So starting out, I think I heard Katie mention the climate crisis, and obviously when we think crisis and climate, um, the things that jump to mind for me are often these sorts of images that you see in front of you, whether it's the next spill, the next fire, the next flood, whatever it is. There are any number of images like this that pop up on our phones, pop up in headlines, so many gallons, that kind of thing. And it's important to have that always front of mind to create that sense of urgency. But coming into this, I've just been reflecting a lot lately how that can be sometimes really overwhelming, and how it's important for us to try to find and seek out spaces of joy and happiness in nature, because that's ultimately for me one of the things we're going towards. So just wanted to start open with this acknowledgement that this is what we see, and this is a reality that's in front of us. But to keep in front of mind that that's not the way we want it to be, and to keep the goal in mind as well. So um, just wanted to talk a little bit about trees first. So Pennsylvania, the Keystone State, and trees. Pennsylvania, if you did not know, I think hopefully many know that that actually means Penn's Woods. So a very forested state, at least a while ago, before a lot of damage has been done. So historically, Pennsylvania had greater than a 90% coverage of forests. And depending on where you were at in the state locally, that could be upwards of 100%. So that's how we got our name. That's why we have our name. Today, that's not necessarily the case. We have about 60% coverage across the state, and again, still a matrix of how that forest canopy is distributed across the state. And compared to some others, that's still pretty good. Like, we have a lot to be proud of, but we could always do better, and we should always seek to do better. So there's kind of this whole piece of quantity of forest that has come down. In terms of quality, we also have a significant decrease. So I listed out a few species here: American chestnut, American elm, that are nearly gone from our landscape. Eastern hemlock is one that is decreasing rapidly, just due to different blights, pests, invasives that are kind of taking over and decreasing the quality of our forest. And I did put this question mark here because we don't necessarily know which one is going to be next. So in Pennsylvania, we have a strong history of forests, but our quantity and quality of forests have both been decreasing, and that's a problem. However, again, to put a positive spin on this, we do have significant still wild spaces on the left that are full of intact forests or near intact forests. The places where many people live, whether it's a suburban park or a backyard forest, this kind of photo in the middle, where people often interact with forests the most. And then even in our busiest urban spaces, we have tree-lined streets. So we do have a lot to be proud of. wanted to touch a little bit on that kind of quality of tree piece and think about what a native tree is and what trees that aren't native are. So there's a lot of words here. I'm going to try to break it down a little bit. On the left, we've kind of got three different categories of trees, different ways you could describe them. Those three being native, non-native, which is also sometimes called introduced, and then the third category is invasive. So native trees are trees that occur naturally throughout a range, and this is a very scientific definition, but they occur throughout a range, so across a geography, in a particular kind of habitat, which might be riparian or next to a stream, maybe on the top of a mountain, but there is some kind of characteristic area that this tree would find itself in. And then where over evolutionary time, so we're talking like long amounts of time, it's adapted and co-evolved to live with other trees, other plants, other animals that also call that habitat home. So there's kind of this long history, an arc where we can see and trace how this tree or plant has kind of made its way into the landscape. Next, we have non-native trees, which obviously also have undergone this kind of natural arc and range. But in this case, that tree went through that process somewhere else that is not where we are now. And then it's been introduced into a part of a range or outside of the co-evolved space or that particular habitat into a new area. And so that's a tree that's introduced. It could be a tree from another country. It could be a tree from another state. It could also be as simple as a tree that grows on the top of a mountain in Pennsylvania to a tree that is planted in a riparian space and maybe wouldn't necessarily find itself there. So there's a lot of different things that can be non-native or introduced. Sometimes when we have trees that are introduced, things go wrong. And that's the third category. So invasive. So that's a tree that's been introduced and it establishes itself. So it's reproducing, it is doing well, almost too well. And on top of that, it's causing significant damages, which if it meets any one of these three in this list, ecological, economic, or social damage, it's then at that point considered invasive, which if you have seen in the news, this is one of those kind of negative news things that kind of makes its way in headlines. And this applies beyond just trees. This is for kind of all life forms. So you may have seen spotted lanternflies, for example, are an invasive insect pest. I just want to point out here that often, just based on the way that our society and our markets work, things are most often described as invasive when they meet the economic factor, just because profits are what drives so much of what we run on. And so often the ecological and social damages get left behind, or things are more slowly defined as invasive, at least from a legal standpoint based on that. So just something to keep in mind that, for example, in Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture is what determines what plants are labeled invasive, and that's based largely on economic damage to agricultural crops. And we know that there are many more plants in Pennsylvania that are doing economic damage than just agricultural pesticides. So with that in mind, I have some prioritization and then some photos on the right here. So native trees, when we're thinking about trees, from my viewpoint at least, are a top priority, a must. I've put on the top my favorite native tree, which is an American sycamore. So again, grows in riparian habitats, also sometimes a popular urban tree, or a hybrid of it is a popular urban tree, the London plane tree, if you've heard of that. So another a little bit more about non-native or introduced trees, as long as they have not proceeded to the invasive state, they're appropriate to use for a variety of different reasons, like aesthetics, function, sometimes landscaping plants. they're a good thing to lean on when we want like a very specific cultivated kind of look or use that a native plant can't provide to us. And so I've got one here on the right, which is Japanese Zelkova. It's a pretty, which obviously Japan, so it's not from our native range here, and it's a pretty common urban suburban tree. Just based on its form and function, it really performs well, and so that's an appropriate use of that plant because it's staying where it is and not escaping and causing damage. Um, and then on the bottom here, our infamous tree of heaven, which is a host for the spotted lanternfly. So that's invasive in its own right. It spreads like crazy and takes over ecological habitats and all that kind of thing. And on top of that is now a host for an invasive insect. So there's a lot going on with that one. When it comes to benefits of trees, there's a bunch here. I just kind of tried to lay out some photos that would show some of the basic ones. On the top left here, I was thinking air and air quality. So not only do trees produce oxygen through photosynthesis, but they also filter out different pollutants, especially in urban spaces. They also can trap and retain dust and dirt on their leaves, again, improving air quality. When it comes to water, they help with both quantity and quality. So soaking up water into the ground, filtering the water, and also keeping all the water from rushing downstream and causing local flash floods and things like that. And then biodiversity, trees are really ecosystem engineers. So forest habitats provide some of the highest amount of diversity that we have in terrestrial ecosystems, especially in Pennsylvania. So I put a black bear there. I was at my family cabin a few weekends ago in northern Pennsylvania, and we were lucky enough to see a black bear. So I was thinking of them lately. In the bottom left, or in the bottom row here, we also have some benefits to people. So this first one, I've been thinking about climate change, thinking of the climate crisis. So trees in urban spaces can provide temperature differences up to 20 degrees difference between shaded and non-shaded areas. There's a whole host of benefits and a growing literature on public health or on climate benefits from trees. So they help with both mitigation and adaptation. So when we're thinking about the climate crisis, there's this whole piece of, we need to mitigate or stop climate change from happening further, try to pull some of the carbon out of the atmosphere. Trees do that through photosynthesis, but also the adaptation piece. So changes are happening. We need to figure out how to live with them. So that's kind of the temperature piece. Trees are one of the solutions that we have that kind of meet both of those pieces of the equation. This middle photo on the bottom is Penn State Hershey Medical Center. So there's actually a lot of health benefits to trees, both interacting with them, being out in the outdoors. Forest bathing is a popular thing, which can help with both mental and physical health, alongside more traditional Western medicine. But even something as simple as having a view of trees from outside of your window in the hospital has been shown to improve recovery times. So that's there's just numerous benefits when it comes to health, some of them that we're still trying to understand. And then last is this kind of trying to show a lot of things in this one picture, but social benefits, which can be anywhere from connecting with other people in nature, children getting to experience nature and be disconnected from devices, even job and economic opportunities. There's all of these kind of human dimension pieces that fit into this last bucket. So our goal, obviously, with thinking about all of these great things that trees do is to try to get more trees out in the landscape, work more towards that 90%. So when you're planting trees, things often go best with a few different things. The first one will be site prep. So I have control competing plants here, but depending on where you're planting, that could look like a lot of different things. In a downtown street tree planting, it could be cutting up the curb and getting a soil amendment in there. In a park, it could be ensuring that you won't have children in the park on the day when you're trying to plant. So kind of doing that first look at what is the landscape now and what do we need it to look like in order to have this planting be successful. The second is making a plan. So laying out the planting, and when you're doing so, making sure that you're planning for the future, because trees need to be maintained over time. And like, for example, it would be really bad to place your trees really, really close to each other if you need to get a mower through them. Or it might not make sense to plant the tree directly next to the school or that kind of thing. So kind of trying to think strategically about what you need to do to set yourself up for success before the trees are in the ground, because they're a lot harder to move once they're there. And then last is planting them. So I have a little diagram on the right. It's an example of a bare root tree planting. I think most of the trees you're going to be planting are containerized trees, but it's still a similar strategy, at least as far as it goes when it comes to digging a hole that's wide enough. One of the biggest things that causes a planting to fail is if if your tree tube is like this big around and you dig a hole that is that big around, it's really easy for there to be air pockets in there, and air pockets are certain death for tree roots. So what you want to do is kind of dig a wider hole that kind of is almost like a cone shape sometimes, so that you can go in and backfill, kind of as shown as this picture in the middle, and start to fill in to ensure that there's solid contact between roots and soil all throughout. And similar to potting at home, you can tamp down a little bit as you go, but you don't want to be pushing too hard because then there's no space for air and water in there. And then another big failure point for trees is like this one on the right, which is planting a tree way too low. There's a root collar at the bottom of the tree, which is a little kind of tiny nub where you can see where it goes from where the tree is supposed to be below the ground and where the tree is supposed to be above. Kind of hard to explain digitally. So on my slide here, I've got a good video from the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay, which is a group I love. And they go through this in a lot more detail. It's a 10-minute video. So I will share these slides with Katie, and this link will be in here for you all so that you can get a really good demonstration from one of my favorite groups. Oh yeah, and so planting trees goes best with all of these things, but I also think that it goes best with friends. So it's always nice to plant with others, connect with others who have a shared sense of importance and urgency, or if they don't, just it can be a teaching moment for you to try to bring others into the circle. And of course, this applies to both people friends and animal friends as well. So Katie also asked me to speak a little bit about why I plant trees from a faith-based perspective, which is kind of the first time I've ever been asked this. So it was interesting to be able to think about it. And so, hold up, I'm going to go to my notes here because I don't want to mess this part up. So I know that these aren't pictures of trees, but these are photos of a monarch butterfly that's in a pollinator garden that I planted outside of my house. And this was kind of a moment for me recently where I got to just stop and reflect on this kind of thing and think like, wow, why am I doing these things? And so for me, it kind of came down to three different things. So I'm Episcopalian, and that is kind of the perspective that I am coming from. Certainly not the only one out there, but just wanted to kind of preface with that's where I'm coming from. So the first is just creation. And so when I am out in nature, whether it's in a forest, in a park, or even just outside of my house at the pollinator garden, when I'm seeing this monarch butterfly finally using the black-eyed Susans and purple coneflowers that I planted, I feel a sense of wonder, awe, and joy when I'm out in nature. For me, it represents a reflection of the creator, because for me, that's like this is a palette that has been made to be something that is supposed to reflect beauty, and that's what I see when I see this. And so sometimes I'm just taken aback. I think this was actually in the middle of the workday, and I just had to like take a moment and sit there and just watch and watch and watch, and be quiet and find that time. So that's the first, is creation and just what it inspires and fills me with. The second, going a little bit deeper, would be connection. So I get to experience that connection with myself, kind of an introspective moment to sit and think, but also connection to nature. So for me, this was fun to be able to walk to the different points of my pollinator garden where this monarch is visiting, watching pollination happen. And then a few weeks later, I didn't get photos of this, but the walnut tree out behind my house, like there was a pair of monarchs that ended up kind of jumping off from here. They mated and they hung out in that tree for a while. And I just, yeah, it fills me with a sense of looking at connections in nature and just being inspired by them. Um, and then also just being able to connect with others, like I said, is something important for me, being a remote worker now and just getting to find time to be outside, both with myself when I need it and with others when that's the appropriate move too. And so then the third thing, so I've got creation, connection, and third would be care. So when I'm at church each week and I am praying, and when my congregation is praying, honestly, together, we make a commitment to accept responsibility, demand respect, and take action. And that's part of our service. And it's always a grounding moment for me. For us, it's during the prayers of the people. There's just a certain moment where I reflect back and remember, yes, this is something I am called to do. It's something that we are called to do. And so that moment on Sunday, even if I spend a whole week trying to work on this stuff and get frustrated with work, it's a grounding moment for me on Sundays to have that prayer time and reflect and remember that. So yeah, I just a little bit here. I wanted to encourage others to take that same moment of reflection that I often find myself easily glossing over. So I've just got some questions here. I'm probably over time, so I was gonna have folks put this in the chat, but happy to have you put this in the chat still as you think through some of these questions, and maybe there will be time later. But yeah, just thinking about positive experiences you've had, benefits that come from trees, how your faith or prayer life intertwines with trees. And then also didn't want to assume that everyone also automatically feels this connection. So if you don't feel this yet, or if you want to go deeper, where might you go to learn more? I just really encourage you to take the time to sit and think about these, because Pennsylvania needs more trees, ideally native ones, and a lot of them. To be successful, we need to make sure that we plant them for survival. So visit that video when you get the link. Remembering that planting in community builds community. And then if you can think back to that first slide with pictures that I had where it was all doom and gloom, as you reflect on what inspires you, I encourage you to just hold on to that fiercely and don't forget it, because that's what's going to drive us to the point where we don't have to think about those things. So thank you.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you for sharing from your particular context. I think that regardless of the faith traditions or the non-faith traditions from which you may be joining us on this call, there is so much value in hearing from the wisdom and perspective of others and the ways that they're connecting to themselves and to their community. So thank you, Jason, for taking some time to explore that final prompt that I gave you to think about how it is personally connected for you. Greg dropped off the call, but I think, did you make it back on through, Greg? All right, while I try to figure out and make sure that Greg is with us and get him situated, he will provide some updates on kind of the plant distribution. Hopefully you all are kind of feeling in a place at this point that you have some idea of the trees that you are getting and where you are going to get them. And you should be hearing more if you are just receiving plants. You should be hearing more from wherever your pickup site is as those trees are made available. But I'm going to turn it over to Kristen now to maybe just walk us through some time for Q&A. So I know Kristen may have a question or two kind of prepped for Jason and Greg, if we can get Greg back on. And then we will also you can utilize the chat to share questions if you have it, or you can just utilize the raise hand function. We have a lot of folks on the call right now, so if you can use one of those two options just so we have a little bit of order, that would be phenomenal. Thank you.
Awesome. Hey, everybody. I'm Kristen. As Katie mentioned, I am a conservation coordinator with PA IPL. So just to kick off our Q&A, like Katie said, if you guys have questions already, feel free to raise your hand or type it in the chat. I don't see anything yet. So, Jason, I don't know if you would mind answering a question or two that I have about your experience planting trees.
Yeah,
Yes.
sure.
So you mentioned a lot about like what keeps you going with the work that you do, like why you do it and the connections to your faith. Can you talk about maybe like an aha moment or like where this all really started for you?
Oh, wow. A single moment. I guess,
Like a particular experience.
yeah, yeah. So, I was fortunate enough that my parents kind of, when we took a vacation, they would pack us up and take us to a state park, or as we got older, we even got to visit some national parks out west. So I know for me, one place was Redwoods National Park in Northern California. It was just kind of an awe-inspiring moment. I think it was between when I was a freshman and a sophomore in college, and I went back to school like at the end of the summer and immediately declared my major as environmental studies. So I think that was a moment for me, just finding those wild places, if that's what inspires you, and spending time in them.
Yeah, that's a really like eloquent way to put it. So thanks for sharing your perspective there. So I do see one question in the chat, and it is why are bare root trees only to be planted in the spring?
Yes, I saw that one, and it's a good one. So um, there's a few different kinds of stocks of trees that you can use, and bare root is one that's often a little bit more challenging to plant for inexperienced folks. And so we often don't use them with volunteers, or maybe only volunteers who've been on a bunch of plantings before. So you're less likely to encounter that. But in the spring, so bare root trees, because they're bare root, it's a little bit harder to get that dirt to root contact. And so that kind of improves with moisture. And so in the spring, there's a lot more rain, which helps the trees settle. So it's just a lot harder for them to dry out in the spring. And it's a little bit easier for that to happen in the fall. So we try to keep bare roots to the spring. Um, yeah, I think that answers that one. So, and for the other ones, for like the small containerized seedlings or even some of the larger ones, sometimes they get so dry or the soil mixture is just a certain way that all of the soil just falls off when you pull it out of the container. And then you're basically planting a bare root anyway. So certainly watching a bare root instructional video is still very helpful for someone who might be planting containerized seedlings.
Awesome. Thank you for the thorough answer there. So the next question is, I use fallen leaves as mulch. Since we know that black walnut trees' roots contain a toxin-like substance called jugalone, is it okay to use black walnut leaves as mulch?
I have to admit, I'm not sure about the leaves. My guess would be no. Um,
Yeah,
so
my understanding is no too.
yeah. So and certainly even beyond that, just planting around black walnut trees can be a challenge. So oftentimes if we're using black walnut in a planting, we'll try to plant them in a cluster edge instead of interspersing them amongst all the other trees. So
Yeah, that's a really great point. And really good attention to detail there. I wouldn't have even, thought to be that specific about, what leaves we're putting around our plants. Um, okay, awesome. So our next question is from Donna. So are the tubes supposed to be enclosed? Are the tubes supposed to also enclose the leaves, or do we cut the tubes?
so when we plant with tree tubes, I didn't have any pictures of those, but they're kind of those large candlestick looking things that are plastic. They have a flared end on one of the tubes, and that's the end that goes up towards the sky. So when you're planting on a seedling or on a plant that's maybe 18 inches tall normally, the whole thing is going to go in the tube, leaves and all. and you're going to try to get the tube about, a half an inch to an inch in the ground, to prevent it from frost heaving out. And then the leaves, as the tree grows, it's kind of a greenhouse in there for the first year or two. And so it's going to grow really fast and kind of get out the top. And then there will be leaves out the top, and you're not going to take the tube off right away. You're going to let it sit there for a while. There's a bird net on it. You'll pull the bird net off when the leaves get to the top, because then there's enough traction for birds to get up out of the tube. But you do want to make sure that the tree is significantly taller than when leaves first pop out the top, so that it can survive buck rub, because Pennsylvania has an overabundance of deer. I think I've answered that question. I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's really helpful and a great point about buck rub. I've had entire plantings get just completely decimated by buck rub. And there's a lot of preventative measures that we've used. There's some sprays that help sometimes, or just, really trying to reinforce with stakes and things like that. But yeah, deer browse is such a strong influence on our area. So that's a great thing to highlight. Okay, so the next question is from Ruth. So we use tubes only for thin trees. For shrubs and trees with low, for shrubs and trees with low branches already, we build cages out of 2x4 welded wire. I guess that's more a comment. I've definitely seen people use like cages and things for shrubs. If you don't have that many materials at your disposal, do you know any other alternatives that can be used, Jason?
Yeah, so in a pinch, I've also seen sometimes they make like a similar version of a shrub tube that's a little bit wider and much shorter than a normal tree tube, but still made of the same material. And I've seen those used for shrubs as well, so that they have, or for trees with lower branches that kind of don't have that straight form. And that gives them a chance to kind of still have that protection, so they don't get munched to the ground, but they still have the chance to spread out. So that's one option. Another option in a pinch, definitely not recommended, but you could just cut a normal tree tube in half and use that. So I've seen that work on a budget. And then, yeah, at my folks' place, they definitely use the welded wire cages, just purely because they have access to it, and it's a little bit more visually pleasing than having the tree tubes. So, and then of course you can kind of build a custom, how far out do you need it to go, and that kind of thing. Another option, which is not always the go-to, but can work in certain instances, is a Miyawaki planting. So that's a Japanese word, Miyawai, I think is the spelling, but it's basically a really, really dense planting, often with soil amendments under it. And planting really densely like that can actually create more of like a micro forest environment where the trees will grow up, can kind of prevent browse in that it's a whole unit instead of an individualized little plate for a deer to walk up to. So
That's interesting. I'm gonna have to look up that planting method later. I've actually never heard of it. But that's great. So our next question is from Nathan. On the topic of tubes, are there some plants that do better with them and some on our list that are not recommended for tubes?
I'm not sure that I haven't seen the list to go through it and know it. But oh, I think Greg has just hopped on.
I have.
Hi, Greg.
I apologize. Boyd, I don't know where I was, but I was in limbo for a long time.
Welcome back, Greg.
Thank you. Shall I jump in with what I was going to do, or?
Actually, there's one question that I think you might be able to answer better than I can, Greg, before
What's
you
that?
do that. So it's a question about tree tubes and whether there are some trees on the list for distribution this fall that would do better with something other than a traditional tree tube.
Well, spice bush, I usually don't use a tree tube just because it really doesn't get chomped by the deer much. In terms of what I would use wire net, if I had the time and the resources to do it, or to, fencing, would be anything that branches profusely right away from the get-go, bushy, so that it can get its natural growth pattern. I don't have the time to do that with the number of trees we put in, but that's what I'd like to do.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So Katie, did you want to pivot quick? It looks like we have maybe one question left.
Yeah, why don't we cover that, and then Greg, we can move into some short updates on distribution and any updates
Okay.
you want to give to folks.
Okay.
Okay, so from Donna, do you have any pointers on getting seedlings out of their containers? I guess maybe when they're root bound, sometimes like the roots will grow out from underneath the plastic or something.
Yeah. Okay, so there's a few different ways you can do this, and it kind of depends on exactly what the problem is. So sometimes it might take one or two to try to figure out the best strategy for that particular batch. Some things that I found helpful are if it's one of the square containers, you can just kind of try to squeeze them together with your hands like this on each side and try to scoot it out a little bit. That doesn't always work. Sometimes if there's a hole in the bottom, you can take something small and round. Sometimes I have like a pocket knife or the back of a pocket knife that I can kind of try to jam in there a little bit to try to encourage it to push out a little bit. And then a last option, which is time consuming, especially if you're planting a lot of trees, is to take the pocket knife, open it up, or if you've got clippers or something, and try to clip usually down one of the corners or right next to one of the corners, and then you can kind of peel it off. Yeah, not always the easiest, but there's definitely workarounds, and it is worth the extra investment of time to try to get it out whole and intact rather than just yanking it out, because at that point, if you just kind of start to go, sometimes some of the roots tend to stay with the soil instead of with the tree, which is not great.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I've definitely had quite a few trees that, they've really grown around the bottom of the container.
Yeah.
So there is one last quick question on here. So do we not need to use tree tubes if we don't have deer?
I would say that you should use them for a variety of other reasons. Voles are a real issue. Rabbits are a real issue. Weed whackers and lawnmowers are a really big one. So I tend to use it. If I have one that doesn't really need it for deer, then I'd use a small round or wider tube, the short 2-footer. So.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for answering all the questions in so much detail.
So, Greg, while we still have, so kind of what we have planned at this point is just to share a couple of updates in terms of the process. Like I already said earlier, you should have a good sense, hopefully, of where you stand with the order that you requested and what those dates look like. If you didn't receive an email, it should have come from info@paipl.org. It should have had a nice PDF attached to it that outlines your whole order. If you didn't get that, you can always reach out to me or the info@paipl.org address, and we can get you situated. But Greg, do you want to provide any just general updates other than that in terms of how the distribution process is looking for this fall?
Also in the PDF that Katie's talking about, there should be a delivery date to your primary host. And on that day, we ask that you not come unless you have contacted me or one of the hosts and are a volunteer. We need volunteers that day, but we can't really probably plan on distributing trees that day. It's a complicated process, and sometimes too many cooks spoil the trees. And so we just need to get them separated and to the secondary hosts as quickly as possible. And then your host will contact you relatively quickly, maybe even that day, and say, okay, we're ready to go, come when you can, or they'll give you some parameters. I also wanted to let you know that we have at the primary distribution sites, there's 9 of them, we have a surplus of trees, sometimes as much as 600, 700, 800 extra trees. And so we will do a tree for all, kind of either in conjunction with the distribution to the people who pre-planned or pre-requested trees, or the weekend after that. And that will be determined again by how quickly we can get everything set up. And there will be an email that goes out to anybody who has asked to know about that. And if you would like to know, if you're getting your trees, but you'd love some more, or you didn't get something in one place, it might be available at a different primary. You can ask me, I have a sense of that, but if for instance, my distribution site is entirely out of Spice Bush, it could be that Huntington, for instance, which is another place near me, has it. So you might check that out. If you want to sign up to get information about the tree for all, my email is in the chat, and just send me an email and I'll put you on a contact list, and I can contact you the most quickly. I will also let Katie know when those tree for alls are, and she will send out a big email through PA IPL, but that takes a little longer to have happen. I think those are the details that I have. Maybe, I don't know if anybody has questions about those details or how we want to proceed from here now.
Yeah, so if there's anyone who is a planter this season who has questions, happy to hear from you. You can unmute and ask. Hopefully that means that we have answered your questions either in the emails or through tonight's program. Yes, Greg.
I don't know if you guys mentioned while I was in limbo, but we did a program like this last year with a lot more detail on planting. And we have a recording of that. Because you signed up and because you're a planter, we will send you not only an email or a copy of this video, but also the one from last year. So look for that, and there may be a lot of questions that didn't get asked that you'd like to know about in that other video. So.
Yes, and so that information, just the presentation from Jason, will all come in a follow-up email that you can look for. And if you have any questions, again, if your question is specific to tree species or variety or delivery dates or logistics, Greg is your best person to connect with directly, or the host that is named in your request sheet. If your question is about, I didn't get my order form, or I don't understand what's happening in terms of the emails and the different things you've received, reach out to me. I'm the best person to help kind of with the email or making sure that you have the right information that you need to get what you need.
Yeah, obviously technological expertise is not in my court.
We're working together as a team, and so really appreciate the patience. These processes take a lot of time and coordination and effort for us to get from start to finish. So thank you for being on the journey with us and for your patience. It really is appreciated. All right, so that kind of concludes our formal program for the evening to a close. If you would like to stay on, we're going to host a short time of conversation for our distribution site hosts, and also for anyone who's interested in volunteering regarding both the primary site delivery dates, if you signed up to help volunteer for those, or you're interested in being involved in what that looks like for next year, we'd invite you to stay on if you have a few more minutes. But other than that, we have finished what we had hoped to cover with you tonight, and we looked forward to seeing you somewhere out in the field with a lot of trees.
Thank you.
And Jason, thank you for coming and sharing with us this evening. Really appreciated your perspective, and I think your work in the international wildlife space has further honed your insights around why you love and care about this work in the community here. So thank you for sharing.
Yeah, thanks again for the invite. I'll probably hop off. I have to go grab dinner. So, but I think I already shared my slides, so you have what you need. But if there's something else I can provide to help folks out, just let me know.
Thank you, Jason.